All right, let's talk about something that's really shaking things up in Asia. What if I told you that a brand new military ranking says India's Air Force is actually stronger than China's? Yeah, let's dig into how on earth this claim came to be.
So let's just get right to the headline here. The 2025 Global Air Powers Ranking has put the Indian Air Force ahead of China's. And yes, you absolutely heard that right. It's this pretty startling claim from the World Directory of Modern Military Aircraft, and it's kicked up a ton of surprise, a lot of debate, and, you can bet, a whole lot of national pride.
So, the big question is, how is this even possible? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack the whole thing. First, we'll look at the shockwave this ranking sent out. Then, we'll dive into why this seems so counterintuitive by looking at China's on-paper strength. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how they measure true air power. We'll also see where everyone fits in the global context, check out the reactions from the rivals, and then zoom out to see what this all means for the bigger strategic picture.
All right, so first up, the immediate fallout. Look, this report wasn't just some, quiet update to a military database. No, this made some serious waves, especially in India and China, the two countries right at the center of it all.
And you can see the reactions were, well, they were like night and day. Over in India, this was a moment of just huge national pride. But in China, it was more of a, wait, what moment. The report just blew up on social media, with tons of people asking that one simple question. How could India possibly be ranked higher than us?
And you know what? That's a totally fair question, because when you just look at the stats on paper, China seems to have this massive military and tech lead.
I mean, just look at the raw numbers. China's defense budget is something like 5 times bigger than India's. They can build their own fighter jets, their own engines. That's something India is still working on. And on top of all that, China's already flying 5th-gen fighters, and they even claim to have 6th-gen jets in the works. We're talking about assets that are just way, way more advanced.
So, this really brings us back to the central puzzle, right? With all of those advantages, how in the world did the Indian Air Force pull ahead in this ranking? Well, the answer isn't so much about what they're measuring, it's about how they're measuring it.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds a bit and look at the methodology here. Because this ranking isn't just about counting up all the planes a country has. No, it's a much more holistic kind of assessment.
It's all based on something called a TVR score, which stands for Total Value Rating. And the whole idea behind it is to give a really complete picture of an Air Force's actual combat strength, looking beyond just the simple numbers.
So this TVR score is built on 4 main pillars. You've got quality, how good is the tech, how old is the equipment. Then there's quantity, the sheer number of planes and weapons. You also have readiness, basically how quickly can they get things up in the air and ready to go. But that last pillar, that's the real game changer here, experience. We're talking about the actual real-world use of all this hardware in a real fight.
And this is the absolute key to the whole thing. The report argues that while China might win on quality and quantity, India has this decisive edge when it comes to experience. They point specifically to things like Operation Sindhoor, that 2019 aerial skirmish with Pakistan over Kashmir. That's where Indian pilots showed they could perform under immense pressure in a real combat situation. China, for all its shiny, advanced hardware, just doesn't have that kind of recent, hard-won combat experience.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this India-China thing, we need to zoom out for a second and look at the full global rankings. This really helps put everything into perspective.
So take a look at this table. The first thing that just jumps out at you is America's insane dominance, right? They've got 4 of the top 5 spots locked down. But look a little closer, down at number 6 and 7. And there it is, India, with a TVR score of 69.4, just edging out China at 63.8. Now that might seem like a small margin, but in the world of geopolitics, that's a huge, huge statement.
Now, as you can probably imagine, a report like this doesn't exactly fly under the radar, especially not for China and its close ally Pakistan.
China's reaction was, let's say, pretty predictable. It was swift and it was dismissive. Their state-run media, the Global Times, basically called it a silly on-paper comparison that doesn't show real power. But the source we're looking at here suggests that if you read between the lines, this sounds less like a confident clapback and more like a sign of some real frustration.
And what about Pakistan, India's other big rival in the region? Well, the report puts their Air Force way, way down at 18th place. And the source argues that this is no accident.
They connect that low ranking directly to their performance back in that Operation Sindhoor skirmish in 2019, which frankly put some of their big weaknesses on display for the whole world.
Okay, so finally, let's zoom out to the really big picture. How does a simple shift in a military ranking actually translate into real-world strategy? The source we're digging into offers a pretty fascinating take on the geopolitics of all this.
The argument from the source is that Beijing's very loud, very public dismissal of this report is actually hiding a much deeper fear, the fear of a two-front war. The thinking is that China is worried this ranking could make India feel more confident, more bold, and the absolute nightmare scenario for Beijing, according to this analysis, is that they get bogged down in a fight over Taiwan, and then a newly confident India decides that's the perfect time to make a move on their shared border.
And this all leads to a really interesting psychological point the source makes. The idea here is that China's constant talk about its own superiority, it's a bit of a projection. I mean, think about it, right? When someone has to keep telling everyone how strong they are, it might just be because they're worried people are starting to doubt it. It could be a sign that fear, not confidence, is what's really driving what they're saying.
And that really brings us to the final, critical question that sits at the very heart of this debate. In today's world, does battle-tested experience actually outweigh a pure technological advantage? In an age of stealth fighters and hypersonic missiles, how much does a pilot's gut instinct and real-world combat wisdom really count for? That's the question this ranking forces everyone to think about. Thanks for tuning in.